Well, Christy and I were here first service last week. We were gone second service. We had to catch a flight to a once-a-year leaders retreat that we go to for the Vineyard USA. But man, so we got to hear Ron. Didn't Ron do a great job for Vineyard Columbus if you were here last week? I mean, I thought Ron just did a great job teaching on marriage. Good stuff. A lot of info in a short amount of time, but man, very impactful. So that was good. When I went to Chicago, met one of our friends there that I get to see once or twice a year. His name's Michael Gatlin. He is the head of Multiply Vineyard, which is the church planting arm of Vineyard USA. And there's a picture of Michael we'll bring up here, and you'll get to see him. Michael was telling me this story. Michael's beard's a little longer now. Probably goes down to the V of his jacket now. He was telling me this story. He was flying from Minneapolis to Chicago to go to this meeting we were at, and as he approaches his gate, two police officers come up to him and they say, "Excuse me, sir, were you singing?" And that's an odd question. "Excuse me, sir, were you singing?" And he looks, he goes, "No, I wasn't singing." He says, "Well, we've had a report of a man with a top hat and a ZZ Top beard leaving his suitcases at various places around the building and singing." And Michael said, the first thing that came to mind is I was going to say, well, if I was a member of ZZ Top, I mean, the beard would be longer, and this is a bowling hat, not a top hat. But he said, I thought better of it, lest I be tased or have an unwanted cavity search. So I didn't say anything. And so they just keep asking him, "Were you singing, sir?" What's the singing? Finally, they let him get to, the people had already boarded the plane. He was the last one. So they usher him to his gate. He had his gate pass from Southwest on his phone, and so he goes to scan it, and they say, the gate person says, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir, but you've already boarded," this says. And the police look at him even like he's more suspicious because he's already boarded, but he hasn't boarded because he's there. And turns out he starts explaining. He says, "Well, my wife, Brenda Gatlin, uses the same app. Maybe she scanned my boarding pass instead of hers." And they ended up getting it all worked out. And the final thing they asked him was, "Are you sure you weren't singing, sir?" Or no. I like stories like that. I like a good story. Stories are fun. They're engaging. They get the imagination. They kind of, you can put yourself in that position type thing. This is a year of big stories. In fact, we just celebrated big stories a couple weeks ago. At least Hollywood did. Our favorite form of storytelling, it seems like, in our culture right now is the movies. And this is a huge year for storytelling and for movies, particularly for Disney. Disney is they're releasing Captain Marvel just this weekend. They're Dumbo, Lion King, Aladdin, Star Wars 9, Avengers Endgame, Spider-Man, kind of part of the Disney universe. You see some of the movies up there. Frozen 2 coming out. I mean, it's pretty amazing. Toy Story 4, that's all this year. In fact, there are so many big stories, big movies being released by Disney that movie companies, other studios are changing their calendar. Probably the most famous one is Warner Brothers decided to push Wonder Woman 1984 to next year. It's done. It's ready to be released. But they're pushing it ahead, altering the calendar because they said they don't want to compete with all that money that's going to be spent by people going to see Disney movies. In fact, many studios have just steered clear of April because they're assuming everybody's going to see Avengers Endgame. I'll be one of the geeks that does. Isn't that amazing that just all these stories, all these movies will alter the calendar of even movie studios? Stories have that kind of impact. Of course, you know this already, but the story that's made the biggest impact on any calendar is the story of Jesus, right? In fact, the calendar that we use right now is based on Jesus' birth, right? We are in the year 2019 AD, Anno Domini, which simply means the year of our Lord or the year that he was born. Unfortunately, for those scholars a few hundred years after his birth, when they were figuring out his birthday, they were about 4 years old or off. We think he was actually probably born around 4 BC. But nonetheless, the calendar is still based on when they thought he was born. It's amazing. Think about that. For 2019 years, we have been basing our calendar on an event of Jesus' birth. I mean, you start thinking about our calendar in general. I mean, Christmas and Easter and Good Friday and Ash Wednesday. I mean, even some of the ones that have become a little more secularized, but you think of St. Valentine's Day, St. Patrick's Day is coming up. All those based on the story of one guy, Jesus Christ. And that's totally altered our calendars. You know, Jesus came not just to alter calendars or to transform calendars. I don't think that's why he came at all. But he did come to transform lives. And the story of Jesus is not meant to just be a good entertainment story like a movie that you watch and walk away from. But the story of Jesus is to be a story that impacts your story, and not only impacts it, but where you get invited to merge your story into his story. For the next 6 weeks, we are going to be talking about the story of Jesus, working our way up towards Easter. And we're going to talk about Jesus' mission and how Jesus came as a healer and a deliverer, and how he came to welcome people into community, and talk about his humility and his sacrifice and all of that, how it impacts our everyday life if we let him do that. And we'll talk about that. In fact, today we're going to start with where the earliest references of his beginning start that we know of. Of course, he had no real beginning. He's eternal, but where we first hear about him. And we're going to start that in John 1. So you can turn to John chapter 1. It's the fourth book in the New Testament, so about 3/4 of your way through your Bibles. If you're using an analog version, if you're using a digital one, just skip down. You'll find it on your menu. Jesus... his beginning is or the beginning that we know of. He's eternal, but when we first hear about him, we're going to talk about that today. Now you may say, why do I want to listen to this? Well, I think what you'll find out is that Jesus' story is meant to impact everybody. I assume you are here, maybe I'm making the wrong assumption, but I assume you're here because you at least want to be a better person. You want some part of your life transformed. And Jesus is the one that's going to transform your life. Whether you gave your life to Jesus many years ago and you're just looking for pieces and parts of your life to be transformed that you're seeing still needs transformation, or whether you're just here because you thought, I need some help, or I thought church might be a good thing, or I need to get closer to God, but you haven't really sold out to Jesus, I still think you want to listen because Jesus is going to be the way that your life gets better, that your life is transformed. And you're going to learn that over the next 6 weeks of how the person of Jesus, not just his story, but meeting the actual person of Jesus will transform your life. And we're going to talk about that. Now today, we start with the beginning. We start with figuring out who Jesus is and why he's come to the planet and how that impacts us today. So take a look at John chapter 1, and let's look at that together. And we're going to start with the very first verse, as I find it here. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's a short sentence. We'll keep going, but we need to stop there because there's a whole lot packed into that sentence, isn't there? I mean, in the beginning, that's how the book, the story of Jesus, in John's version, John was Jesus' best friend. He's writing about his best friend's life, and he starts with that phrase, in the beginning. Does that remind you of anything? Some of you have read the Bible, or you at least cracked it open one time and started at the beginning, and it says what? In the beginning. So John, right in the beginning of his story of Jesus, is connecting Jesus to the story of old creation, of when the world was created by God. And he's connecting it to old creation in all of its glory, of how cool it was and good it was. But we're also connected to that story, because we know the whole story. We're connected to the fact that it falls apart when men and women rebel against God and choose right and wrong for themselves instead of trusting God. And then all the brokenness in the world, including the brokenness you and I suffer, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, all of it, how that came into being. And so John is tying us into that old story. But this isn't going to be a story of old creation. It's going to be a story of new creation. And as we learn the story of Jesus over the next few weeks, we'll learn how we can be a new creation. It says, in the beginning was the Word. So there's this word, and it's not a great translation. There's not a one-to-one translation for the word that they're trying to translate here from Greek or even Hebrew that they were speaking. Greek is what it's written in. There's not a great one-on-one where you can just translate it into one word. Word is the best that they've come up with. But there's some other translations, like J.B. Phillips' translation, that translates it word in action. In their thinking, when they used this particular word for word meant an expression of somebody, an extension of somebody. It was word in action. And so in the beginning was this word. The word was there at the beginning. And the word was with God, meaning whatever this and whoever this word is, he is distinct from God. He can be with God, so he's distinct. And yet at the same time, the very last phrase of that sentence says the word was God. So he's distinct, and yet somehow he is sharing the nature and essence of God. And what does this word do? What does this extension and expression of God do? Word in action do? He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Let's unpack that a little bit. So the word, this word in action, this expression of God, was with God and is God, and the word created the world. And of course, if you remember the old creation story, you know that, right? God just spoke. And this word, this extension of God, this expression of God is what created. He created something out of nothing. There was just darkness and chaos, and God created order, and he created light in the darkness, and he created it with his word. And this word, an extension of God, also God, created everything. It says that he created life that humanity has. He also created light, and we know that light in the old creation was light that broke into darkness and physical darkness. Now we're going to learn a story of the Word in this new creation, that he is light that dispels spiritual darkness in the hearts of men and women. Now you should not see, as we talk about light and darkness at this little juncture, you should not see it as kind of a yin and yang, like equals, They are not equal. Just like light and darkness in the physical realm is not equal. A room this big, if we turned all the lights off and it got dark and we covered the windows there on the doors, it would be dark, right? And if I lit a candle, within a few moments you could see, even though it's just a little candle, because they aren't equal, are they? A little bit of light is way more powerful than a whole room full of darkness. It goes in the physical realm, but it also goes in the spiritual realm. That when the word comes to bring light, as dark as your life may be, as dark as this world may be, when the light shows up, it dispels darkness. So who is this word? We'll jump down to verse 14. Who is the word? The word, verse 14, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So the Word, this expression of God who's distinct from God and yet is made of the same substance of God, this Word became flesh and blood, became one of us and dwelt among us. I love how Eugene Peterson's paraphrase, The Message, puts it. The Word became flesh and blood and moved into our neighborhood. He came to us. He became one of us. And this verse begins to reveal who this Word is. He's the Son of God. We know him as Jesus. I'm going to flip over to Colossians. We'll have it up on the screen if you don't want to flip over. But Colossians 1, verse 15, an early follower of Christ who actually hated Christians, imprisoned Christians before he became a Christian, actually tried to get them to denounce Christ, eventually came to the realization that Christ is God. He wrote this in Colossians 1, verse 15. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things were created. He's agreeing with what John said. The Word was with God in the beginning, and all things were made through him. Things in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. And he's talking about, not about political powers here, although in other verses we know he created all powers, but he's talking about spiritual powers, that angels, demons, all kinds of spiritual things Jesus has created and has authority over. All things have been created through him and for him. So This Word became flesh and blood among us, and this Word created everything, and he has the fullness of God, it says, in him. He is God in the flesh. In other words, when I see Jesus, I see God. Think of everything you know about Jesus right now. Quickly categorize it in your head. Go through the categories. Like, what's Jesus like? He's compassionate. He's a healer. He's a deliverer. He speaks towards legalism as much as he speaks towards immorality. He welcomes people into community. He's sacrificial. He goes to the least and the last and the lost. Think of all the things you can think about Jesus. This Jesus is the image of God. He is God in the flesh. Because remember, the Word is God. And it says the Word became flesh and blood and dwelt among us. That's Jesus. So God became flesh and blood, and everything you see in Jesus, that's God. If you have a hard time conceptualizing God, or maybe you're afraid of God, and there needs to be some bit of fear because he's holy and pure and righteous and sees all our stuff. But if you've had a hard time connecting with him, one of the best ways to connect with him or to get a picture of God is to get a picture of Jesus. If you see Jesus, then you've seen God. He is the image of God. So in the story of Jesus, he is God, eternal. He's distinct from God in that he's an extension or expression of God, and yet he's made of the same stuff as God. He became flesh and blood when he was born in a manger to Mary, and he is God in the flesh now. He's moved into our neighborhood, and when we see him, we see God. And I know when he moved into the neighborhood, not everybody, John says, we won't take the time to read all those verses, but John says he came to his own people, and his own people didn't recognize who he was. They couldn't see that he was God. They didn't accept him. They didn't receive him. And yet, look what happens in verse 14 to those who receive him. Verse 14 in John chapter 1. Let's go to verse 12. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, not a human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. To all who receive him, that's an intimate reception. The word receive here is used like when a husband receives a woman to be his wife, when a mother receives her children, when a friend receives another friend over for dinner. It's a close, intimate friendship. To those who received Jesus and believed in his name, it doesn't mean that they just believed, oh, your name's Jesus, I believe in your name. It means in the ancient world, to believe in somebody's name, it's to believe in their identity, that who they say they are. And Jesus is God. And he says, if you receive him intimately in friendship to the core of your being, and you believe that who he is, who he says he is who he is, then you receive the right. And the right there means full status. Like you have the full status of a child of God. Born again, that's part of this new creation. Not born, it says, of human descent. Doesn't matter your DNA. It matters, do you believe and receive? And if you do, God says, okay, you can be my child with the full rights of child of God. Isn't that incredible? So God comes in the flesh, and he comes so that you and I might be children of God. I'm going to jump back to one last verse in Colossians, because these two just go back and forth so well together. Because I want to know, how does Jesus do that? How does this Word, God in the flesh, come to the planet in the story of Jesus? How does he make us brand new? Look at, if you're, we'll put it on the screen too, Colossians 1:19. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, and don't move from the hope held out in the gospel, this is the good news you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. So in the story of Jesus, Jesus comes to reconcile us so that we might be able to be children of God. And the way he does that is he takes everything that we've done, all of our wrong, and he takes it on his body on the cross. And it says he is the fullness of God that holds the whole universe together, and he brings us together and reconciles us with God. He does it through his cross. Since he is perfect, he doesn't have to die to pay for his sins because he didn't know anything, but he becomes a substitute for every human. And because of that, we can be reconciled. It's as if the cross is a bridge between us and God. It reconciles us, and we can be at peace with God. And not just at peace, not just not at war, but we get the full rights, the full status of a child of God. Isn't that amazing? Now, I know for a lot of the people in the room, this may be like pretty basic stuff. You know, like you've heard this before. I'm hoping that a chunk of you have heard this kind of a thing before. But here's the deal. Even if you've been following Jesus for a long, long time, the story of Jesus needs to impact your life every day, because the story of Jesus is not about having you pray a prayer so you get to go to heaven. That's not the story of Jesus. That's a story that maybe we've preached the last 200 years, but that's not it. The story of Jesus is not that you can go to heaven when you die, although that's a part of it. The story of Jesus is you can enter into the relationship with the King of Heaven now and be under the rule and reign of heaven now. And it doesn't say you'll be experiencing as a child of God when you die. You get to experience being a child of God now. You get to be reconciled with God now. You get to experience a relationship and a receiving at an intimate level of friendship with God now. And then allowing God to transform your life now. And then you get to be a part of doing that for other people. The story of Jesus is that you and I get to live out of an identity as sons and daughters of God now, and that'll change your whole life. Because so many of us chase all kinds of things: ambition, busyness, drivenness, other people's approval, all to try to find our identity somehow. And yet God says you can live from a position of strength, of knowing who you are, the full rights and status as a child of God, a son or daughter. And you live from that place, that'll change your life. He comes to shine light into the darkness. I mean, how many of us have areas of darkness in our life? Maybe it's darkness in the sense of just habits or old hurts that we wish were healed or didn't have us bound up. Well, he comes to shine light into those areas and set us free. Or maybe it's darkness in the sense you have decisions to make and you're not sure which way to go. He comes to bring light and wisdom to big decisions you're making. He comes to do that for you. Or maybe it's the fact that you feel like the world is falling apart, that it's just being blown apart. Maybe your personal world is being blown apart. Well, we just read in Colossians that Jesus not only created all things, he holds all things together. He holds the universe together. And so when you receive him, when you draw closer to him, even if you've been a Christian 50 years, if your world is being blown apart, there is a way to draw close to him and to know that he still holds your life together. And no matter what's going on, you will not be blown apart. He'll hold you through the biggest of storms, through the biggest of chaoses and chaotic times on this world, on this planet. He'll hold you together. So how could you start living this? How could you apply this to your life? Well, I got three ways. One would be, you could, if you've never surrendered your life to Jesus, then I'll give you a chance to do that in a little bit. There may be a few of us in the room that haven't flat out surrendered. Now, what I'm not talking about when I'm talking about receiving Jesus, some say, well, I went to confirmation. Well, that's great if in confirmation you received Jesus intimately and surrendered to him and believed that he was God and in charge of your life. If you have a personal relationship with him, then guess what? then that'll count. But if you never surrendered, if you just went to church, you went through some classes, I don't think that counts. What counts is receiving him. Remember that word is intimately. So have you received him as Lord and as friend, as Son of God? It says, for all who received him and believed who he said he was, which he said he was God. If you receive him that way today, you will be a child of God. Now, many of you have heard this before, but C.S. Lewis, who wrote Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Mere Christianity, and Surprised by Joy, and The Problem of Pain, I mean, all these things, great works. He's once an atheist who became a follower of Christ, who was at Oxford and Cambridge. He said this, the one thing you cannot receive Jesus as is a good teacher, because he didn't leave us that option. Jesus cannot just be a good teacher, because good teachers don't lie. And if he's supposedly a good teacher and claimed to be God, and you don't think he's God, then that means he's a liar, so he's not a good teacher. Don't listen to him. Or maybe he's just crazy. He's just a lunatic, because if you're not lying and you say these things, then you're just crazy to say you're the Son of God, or you're going to rise from the dead in 3 days, or you're going to return someday. That's just crazy talk. So he's a lunatic. Or the only other option is he's Lord. But he can't be a good teacher. He didn't leave that option on the table. And so you have to wrestle with that. If he's the Son of God and you have yet to receive him, why not? What's holding you back today from receiving him and being a child of God and having your identity and being saved and reconciled towards God, not being separated by your sin and rebellion, not trusting yourself for what's right and wrong, but coming close to God? What's stopping you? Not many in the room have already done that. And so, I think one of the things that we could do is since when I see Jesus, I see God, I think the other thing we could do is just be in the Gospels, especially as we progress towards Easter. We could read, for instance, if you started today and you read 2 chapters a day of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you just started in Matthew and read 2 chapters and went through. By Easter, you would cover all 4 Gospels. You might have to read 3 or 4 chapters the last day, I think, when I did the math. But you would see Jesus and you would see God, because when you see Jesus, you see God. So you could do that. But the story of Jesus isn't just about seeing God, it's about being a child of God. And so when I see Jesus, I see God, but when I receive Jesus, I become who God intended me to be, which is a child of God. And so I have to receive that kind of every day almost. Like this ongoing reception of Jesus, I receive who you are and I receive who you say I am. I want to be the image of God that you created me to be, which is your Father's child, a son and a daughter. There's people in the room that I bet you need to receive the light of the world, because there's darkness in your life, and you could just simply receive him and have him point light into dark areas, old habits and old hurts that need healed or that you need set free from, and he'll shine his light in those areas and set you free. Some are making big decisions, and you need to receive Christ, and instead of trying to figure it out on your own or trying to seek 500 other people's advice, you need to seek Jesus. Say, Jesus, this is an area of darkness. I just need to be quiet and still before you. I receive you as the light of the world. Shine on these dark areas of my life that I don't know which way to go. I need wisdom. Would you shine on those areas? Others of you in the room, you need to receive him as the one who holds the universe together, because you are going through a time right now where your world is being blown apart, and it feels like you're unraveling who you are, your world. It's like the foundation is shifted. And so you receive Jesus again and say, Jesus, I believe who you said you are, and you created the world, and you hold the universe together. Will you hold me? And will you hold me together? Will you help me trust you that you're not going to let me unravel and become nothing? Help me, Jesus. So you can receive Jesus over and over again daily and ask him into those areas. When I see Jesus, I see God. When I receive Jesus, I become who God intended me to be, which is a child of God with the full rights and status of God. I want us to move into a time from this teaching into praying for one another and receiving prayer, because I believe Jesus is here and he wants to actually touch people. He wants to invite people to receive him for the first time. He wants to invite people to receive him for the 400th time that need him to shine light into darkness or need them to hold them together. And so I'm going to invite Julia to come up, and she's going to play lightly in the background. And as she comes up, right where you're at, would you just stay seated? And